The courtroom hummed with its usual blend of order and chaos. Lawyers shuffled papers, court staff whispered across the gallery, and in the distance, a gavel echoed like a heartbeat from another chamber. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat high on the bench, draped in black robes that signified her authority, her eyes steady, her expression neutral. Just another day in court, just another file, another defendant. That was her truth, until the bailiff announced the next case. The state of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Her hand froze on the polished oak of the bench. That name. It wasn't just ink on paper. It rang inside her chest like a bell. Her eyes moved to the man being led in, shackles on his wrists and ankles, his steps slow but not unsure. And in a single heartbeat, her past collided with her present. This man wasn't a stranger, he was James Anderson, her James, from a lifetime ago. He looked different, yes, older. Shoulders stooped, face lined by the years, but the eyes, those deep, familiar eyes, hadn't changed. The courtroom fell away in that moment, fading into the blurred hum of memory. The dusty back roads of Hammond, Louisiana flashed in her mind. Racing bicycles, the feel of the wind tangling their laughter, the magnolia tree in her backyard, under which they whispered childhood dreams, the way he once looked at her as if she were the only friend he had in a world set to deny them even that. They came from different sides of the tracks. Her family lived in a modest white house with a porch swing and a picket fence. His stood at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by fields and silence. In Hammond, that divide meant more than geography. It was a separation reinforced by generations of rules that weren't written, but deeply understood. And yet, they found each other. In a creek bed, of all places, where she had wandered too far from home and stumbled upon him fishing. He'd grinned sheepishly, his line caught in the reeds, and she'd offered to help. That moment turned into 1,000 more. But their story didn't last. It was the summer before high school when her father caught them talking on the porch. His voice had been cold, unrelenting. Eleanor, inside, now. And that was it. She remembered James's face frozen between hurt and resignation. "Go on," he had said. "I'll see you around." But he hadn't, not once. His family moved soon after. She buried herself in books, school, ambition. She chased justice with the determination of someone trying to escape something. And now here he was, not as a memory, but a defendant, accused of assault and robbery. Her heart clenched. Her voice, trained over years to sound composed, rang out. "Mr. Anderson, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" His voice was hoarse, strained, but it didn't tremble. "Not guilty, Your Honor." She gripped the gavel tighter, forcing herself to look away from him, from his chains, from the weight of what could never be said. "Proceed." The trial began. The prosecutor, a sharp-featured man named Richard Powell, painted James as a violent criminal. He described a robbery at a Baton Rouge convenience store, a clerk attacked, a cash register emptied. James was found blocks away with the money allegedly in his possession. Eleanor listened. Her eyes, however, drifted to James. He didn't flinch. He sat still, hands folded in front of him, his posture quiet, almost apologetic. But he didn't look defeated. Lisa Porter, James's defense attorney, rose for her opening statement. Young, confident, with a fire in her tone that reminded Eleanor of herself 2 decades ago. She questioned the narrative, highlighted the assumptions. "There's more to this story," she said. "There always is." The first witness, the store clerk, took the stand. His testimony was detailed. He described a man in a red hoodie, aggressive, loud. But under cross-examination, Lisa dismantled his certainty. "You didn't see his face clearly? It was dark, you said. The hood was up." He hesitated. "Yes, but I think—" No further questions. Then came the surveillance footage. Grainy, poorly lit. A man in a red hoodie rushed the counter, but the video ended abruptly. No clear view of the attacker's face. The prosecution argued it was James. Lisa countered that it could have been anyone. James's alibi was shaky. He claimed he'd been walking home from a friend's house, but the friend refused to testify, fearing retaliation. Still, Lisa pressed on. Lack of witness doesn't mean guilt. But Eleanor could see it in the jurors' eyes. Doubt was growing, but so was the weight of expectation. The arresting officer, Daniel Harris, took the stand next. A stocky man with a rough voice, he testified that James was picked up 2 blocks away. He matched the description. Dark clothing, black male, mid-40s. Lisa pounced. Was he wearing a red hoodie? No. Did you search the area for one? No. Why not? We didn't have time. And so you arrested him based on a vague description, without physical evidence. The silence that followed was louder than any answer. A forensic analyst was brought in. He testified that the timestamp on the footage was inconsistent, that based on height and body build, it was impossible to confirm identity. Lisa emphasized this. The prosecution called it speculation. The jury remained stone-faced. Then James took the stand, against advice. Eleanor held her breath. His voice was soft, but every word struck like thunder. "I've made mistakes," he began. "I've taken wrong turns, trusted the wrong people, but I didn't do this. They stopped me because I looked like the kind of person who would. That's how it's always been." His voice wavered, but his gaze didn't. "I'm tired. I just want the truth to matter." The courtroom was silent when he sat back down. Even Powell didn't look so certain anymore. The trial reached its final stretch, closing arguments. The prosecutor leaned on process. Lisa pleaded for vision. See the man, not the assumptions. The jury deliberated for hours. People came and went. James sat silently. He hadn't looked at Eleanor since that first day. She couldn't blame him. What could she say? That she remembered, that she still cared, that she'd once promised to always have his back. Then came the verdict. The jury filed in. The foreperson stood, paper trembling in her hand. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom gasped. Eleanor struck the gavel, restoring order. James didn't cheer. He simply exhaled. Like he'd been holding his breath for years, the clerk processed the release. The room emptied. Eleanor remained. And James approached her. "You don't owe me anything," he said, "but I have to ask, why didn't you say anything?" Her throat ached. "Because I couldn't, not without risking the case, or your life." "Fair," he said, a trace of bitterness in his voice. "That's the thing, it's never been fair." "You're right," she admitted. "I wish I'd done more. I wish I could have done more now. We were kids, we didn't know better. But you do now, don't you?" "I do, and I'm sorry." He nodded just once, then turned and walked out the doors, back straight, head high. Eleanor remained, seated behind the bench that had once felt like a throne. Now it felt like a burden. She had upheld the law, but she had witnessed its limits. Justice wasn't a verdict, it was a promise. One the system broke more often than it kept. She walked out of the courtroom as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the marble steps. And with every step she took, she made herself a promise. She couldn't change the past, but the future, maybe, just maybe, she could make it better. Not perfect, but better. For James, for others like him, and for the girl she used to be. The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that settles deep into the bones and doesn't let go. The trial was moving slowly, each day a deliberate march towards something that felt less like justice and more like inevitability. Prosecutor Richard Powell stood with practiced confidence, his every gesture sharpened by years in court. He painted James as a violent thief, a man who had chosen crime as his path. The narrative was compelling on the surface. There was a witness, a grainy surveillance video, and cash found near James during his arrest. It looked like enough, but Judge Eleanor Morgan could feel something buried beneath it all, a wrong note in an otherwise well-rehearsed song. She sat high on the bench, but her heart was anything but detached. Somewhere in the story being spun before her, something didn't align. And in her gut, she felt the weight of a question that haunted her. Was the law on trial too? James sat at the defense table, still and restrained, but not broken. He didn't move much, didn't react when Powell described him in the cold language of prosecution. He just listened, eyes lowered, jaw tense. Across from him, his defense attorney Lisa Porter was a force of unyielding energy, young, confident, and sharp. She countered Powell's accusations with a fire that burned through the sterile language of court procedures. Her voice, though respectful, carried the kind of defiance that demanded to be heard. She stood not just for James, but for every silent truth buried under the weight of assumptions and stereotypes. She started with the clerk, the supposed eyewitness. Lisa walked the jury through his testimony slowly, carefully. The clerk had said James was the attacker, but under questioning, it became clear that he had never seen the attacker's face clearly. The incident happened at night. The man wore a hood. The clerk admitted he was scared, disoriented. Lisa didn't mock him. She didn't need to. The uncertainty in his voice did the work for her. The red hoodie the suspect was said to be wearing was never recovered. Not at the scene, not on James, not anywhere. It had vanished like a ghost in a story that began to crumble the more it was examined. Then there was the video, the grainy, flickering footage pulled from a nearby store's surveillance camera. Powell had shown it as though it were the final piece of an airtight case, but Lisa pointed out inconsistencies. The timestamp on the footage didn't match the police report. The resolution was so poor it was impossible to confirm the suspect's identity. A shadow, a blur, a vague outline, that was all. She asked the jury a simple question. Would they send a man to prison over a shadow? But it was the testimony of Officer Daniel Harris that shifted the room. Eleanor watched him closely as he took the stand. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid. He answered questions with clipped certainty. He described the arrest, how he spotted James walking just blocks away from the scene. James was wearing dark clothes, walking alone. That was all it took. No weapon was found, no stolen property on his person, no witness who could point directly at him, just the fact that he fit the description, a black man in dark clothes. Lisa rose from her chair, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. Her voice was calm but relentless. She asked Harris if he had conducted a search of the surrounding area. No. Had he looked for the red hoodie the clerk described? No. Had he questioned others nearby? Again, no. She asked plainly, "So you arrested Mr. Carter not because of evidence, but because of how he looked?" Harris hesitated. The pause said more than his eventual answer. Yes, he had made an assumption. A dangerous one, a familiar one. Eleanor felt a shift in the room. It wasn't loud, but it was there, in the posture of the jurors, in the murmur of spectators. Even Powell looked slightly rattled. Lisa had done more than poke holes in the case. She had exposed its foundation as deeply flawed. And Eleanor, despite her robe and gavel, couldn't pretend she didn't see what was happening. It was all unraveling. The case, the certainty, the illusion of justice as blind and balanced. Beneath it all was a truth too uncomfortable to ignore. Then James took the stand. He didn't look like a man fighting for his life. He looked like a man too tired to keep proving his own humanity. His voice was steady, low, stripped of any rehearsed polish. He began not with denial, but with honesty. "I've made mistakes," he said, looking directly at the jury, "but I didn't do this." There was a quiet desperation in his tone, not the kind that begs for sympathy, but the kind that comes from a life lived under suspicion. He explained how they hadn't asked him anything when they arrested him. No questions, no investigation, just cuffs, just a verdict already carved into their eyes the moment they saw his face. "I was guilty before I even opened my mouth." His voice cracked, not from fear, but from something deeper. Exhaustion. Not from this trial alone, but from a lifetime of being judged by shadows and assumptions. Lisa didn't object. She didn't need to. The truth needed no defense. It simply needed space to be heard. James's words hung in the air like smoke, hard to breathe around. Eleanor felt her own throat tighten. She remembered their childhood. She remembered who James was before the streets, before the system, before life carved deep lines into his face. She remembered laughter and scraped knees, dreams and promises made in backyards and schoolyards. Now, here he was, no longer the boy she once knew, but not the man the world claimed he had become either. The courtroom had transformed into a mirror. Every person in it could see a reflection of their bias, their fears, their choices. And Eleanor, seated above them all, saw her own. She saw the path she took, the people she had to leave behind, the silence she carried when she could have spoken. And now James, standing beneath her gaze, asked not for mercy, but for fairness. Could she give it to him? Could the system she was sworn to uphold give it to him? The prosecutor tried to salvage his case. He questioned James about his record, brought up old charges, past decisions. James didn't deny them. He answered with quiet acceptance. Yes, I've been there. I've done things I regret, but not this. That's not who I am anymore. And the jury listened. They weren't just hearing facts. They were hearing a man, a full, complicated, flawed, and real man. As the day ended, Eleanor remained seated long after the courtroom emptied. The quiet was thick, almost sacred. Outside, the world moved on, unaware that something profound had happened in that room. A story had been questioned, a label had been peeled back, a man's life had been allowed for the first time in years to speak for itself. She knew the verdict would come soon. She knew the weight it carried. But more than that, she knew this trial had opened a door, one that couldn't be closed again. Not for her, not for James, not for any of them. It was more than a question of guilt or innocence now. It was about what kind of justice they were willing to live with, and whether the law, in its most honest form, could recognize not just the facts of a case, but the humanity of the person at its center. The storm hadn't passed, but maybe, just maybe, the clouds were beginning to part. The final day of the trial arrived, not with fanfare, but with the quiet thunder of anticipation. The kind that made people breathe a little slower, sit a little stiffer. Outside the courthouse, the skies remained a pale, indifferent blue, but inside, the air was alive with energy that couldn't be ignored. A storm of tension swirled around the courtroom. People sat pressed to the edges of their seats, waiting for the conclusion of a story that had already shifted the ground beneath their feet. James sat at the defense table, his hands clasped together, resting on the cold wood. He didn't move much, but the weight of the week was evident in his posture. Lisa Porter, the young defense attorney who had fought tooth and nail through every minute of the trial, leaned over and said something to him, something only he could hear. He didn't respond. He didn't nod. But there was a flicker in his eyes, like the distant memory of hope trying to find its way back. Prosecutor Richard Powell stood confidently. He was a man who had seen dozens of cases like this, at least on the surface. His voice was even, deliberate. He recited procedures, listed the evidence, underscored the witness testimony and surveillance footage. He urged the jury to look at the facts, not at feelings. His words filled the room, cold and sharp like steel, but something in them felt hollow now, as if even he was struggling to believe the picture he'd painted so confidently just days before. Then Lisa stood, and something shifted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize the moment. She simply talked like a human being speaking to other human beings. She reminded the jury not only of the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, the missing hoodie, the altered timestamps, the unreliable witness, but of something far more dangerous, the habit of assumption. She asked them to consider not just what was said, but what was left unsaid. Not just what was seen, but what was chosen to be believed. She spoke about James not as a defendant, but as a man, a son. A man who had grown up fighting not just for his survival, but for his identity in a world that had often made him feel invisible. And then there was silence. Judge Eleanor Morgan sat high above them all, her face composed and still, but her chest tight with a dozen unresolved memories. She had heard hundreds of closing arguments in her career, but never one that struck quite like this, because this trial wasn't just another name on a docket. This one had history, this one had James, this one had her past. She couldn't speak, she couldn't sway the jury, but every beat of her heart carried the weight of a truth she couldn't unsee. If the verdict faltered, if the jury failed, she would be the last line, the final word. Her gavel would be the instrument of justice, or injustice. The responsibility trembled in her bones. Hours passed. The jury deliberated. Conversations floated through the walls like whispers. People left and returned. Coffee was sipped, nerves frayed, fingers drummed on worn wooden benches. And then, at last, the courtroom doors opened again. The bailiff's voice echoed across the chamber. The jury had returned. Everyone stood. Time slowed. The jurors walked in one by one with measured expressions. No smiles, no tells, just faces carved with the burden of a decision. Eleanor nodded toward the foreperson, signaling them to proceed. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, the foreperson's voice shook slightly. His hands trembled as he held the verdict slip. We find the defendant not guilty." There was a sound. Not a cheer, not a shout, but something that rippled through the courtroom like a wave breaking quietly on the shore. A collective exhale. Someone gasped. A woman in the back cried softly. James didn't move at first. He sat completely still, as if the words had yet to register. Then he exhaled. A long, slow breath he seemed to have been holding his entire life. He was free. But freedom doesn't erase the scars. It doesn't rewind time. It doesn't clean the slate. It simply opens the door. Eleanor struck the gavel. Her voice was calm. The court was adjourned. People rose, gathering their belongings, conversations rising in cautious tones. Lisa embraced James, her composure breaking just slightly. Powell packed up his files, his face unreadable. The jurors walked out, quiet and reflective. The crowd thinned until the room began to empty, like a tide rolling away after the storm. But Eleanor stayed seated. She watched James sign his release papers. His hands didn't shake. His face, though tired, held the stillness of a man who had learned to endure. She thought he would walk out without saying a word. He had every right to. She had stayed silent when it counted. She had watched as others attacked his truth, and though she upheld the rules of the courtroom, she had not defended the child she once knew. But James turned. He looked directly at her, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something heavier, disappointment maybe, or a longing to understand. "You knew me," he said. His voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. "Why didn't you say anything?" The question landed like a stone in her stomach. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the man he had become, but the boy he used to be. She remembered running barefoot through cracked sidewalks, the smell of cut grass and diesel fumes, the summers that seemed to stretch forever. She remembered a friendship that had faded into the shadows of ambition, race, and unspoken choices. She swallowed. Her voice barely reached him. "Because I couldn't. Not without risking the case, or your freedom." James nodded, but his face didn't soften. "Fair," he said, the word heavy with history. "The world's never been fair for people like me." She looked down at the gavel, the symbol of her power and her silence, the one thing she had leaned on her entire life to draw boundaries between herself and the chaos of the world. But now it looked different, smaller, hollow. "I know," she whispered. "I wish I'd done more. I wish I could do more now." There was a pause, the kind that says everything words can't. And then James, whose life had been judged long before he ever stood trial, offered a quiet, searing truth. "We were kids, we didn't know better, but you do now. Don't forget again." He turned and walked out of the courtroom, each step echoing against the walls like a closing chapter. No handshakes, no smiles, just truth left hanging in the air. Eleanor remained seated, alone in the vast silence of the courtroom. The echoes of footsteps faded. The courtroom was empty now, except for the weight that still pressed down on her shoulders. She had done her duty. She had upheld the law. But something inside her told her it wasn't enough. Justice had prevailed this time, but only narrowly. Only because of a defense attorney who refused to yield. Only because a jury chose to see beyond the surface. Only because a man stood up and told his truth even when the world had made a habit of not listening. She thought about all the other Jameses who had never made it to court, whose stories ended in silence, who were convicted not by juries but by circumstances, by statistics, by the machinery of a system too large and too cold. She stood finally. The bench felt taller than usual, more distant from the people it was supposed to serve. She stepped down, walked slowly through the quiet room, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. Outside, the sun was setting, casting golden rays across the courthouse steps. The sky was burning orange, streaked with deepening blue. It felt symbolic, as if the world, too, was caught between what had been and what could still be. Eleanor paused at the threshold, gavel in hand. She looked at it one more time, not with pride, not with reverence, but with the realization that justice wasn't just about verdicts. It was about who got heard, who got believed, who got to walk free, and who didn't. And then she made a vow. She could not change the past. She could not undo her silence. But she could choose how to speak from now on. She could wield her authority not just with precision, but with compassion. She could ask harder questions, look deeper, listen longer, make space for voices like James's, voices that had been silenced for far too long. Because justice, real justice, isn't just about what happens in a courtroom, it's about what happens after. It's about the choices we make when no one is watching. It's about the courage to face the echoes of our own silence and say, never again. As the last light of day spilled across the city, Eleanor Morgan walked down the steps of the courthouse, not just as a judge, but as a witness, to a trial that had tested the limits of law and a vow that would redefine what justice could mean. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The gavel had fallen, but her work was only just beginning. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.